When you lose everything, sometimes you make choices that seem crazy to everyone else. Eli Mercer was down to his last $3,000 when he bought that rusted locomotive, and his whole town thought he'd finally lost his mind. His teenage daughter was embarrassed. His neighbors whispered behind his back. His late wife's family called him foolish. But Eli remembered something his father once told him about a missing train and a secret buried decades ago. Every night after his daughter went to bed, he worked in that cold rail yard with just a flashlight and his father's old tools. The whole town laughed at the widowed father trying to fix a train that would never run again. They didn't know he wasn't trying to make it run. He was looking for something his father said was worth more than gold. What he found inside that forgotten engine was a $187 million discovery that changed everything. But how do you solve a mystery that's been buried for 70 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Millbrook like a grey blanket, softening the edges of a town that had seen better days. Eli Mercer stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun struggle through the clouds as he nursed his second cup of coffee. The ceramic mug, a Father's Day gift from Emma 3 years ago, when she still believed he could fix anything, felt warm against his calloused palms. At 42, Eli carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to bear weight without complaint. His brown hair showed threads of silver at the temples, earned through 2 years of widowhood and 6 months of unemployment. The laugh lines around his green eyes had deepened into something more permanent, carved by sleepless nights spent staring at unpaid bills and unanswered job applications. The house around him told the story of a family doing their best to hold things together. Sarah's presence lingered in every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every family photograph still hanging exactly where she'd placed them. The living room still held her favorite reading chair, a burgundy recliner that neither Eli nor Emma had the heart to move. Her books remained on the side table, romance novels and gardening magazines she'd never finish reading. "Dad, I can't find my history notebook." Emma's voice carried down the stairs, tinged with the particular frustration of a 16-year-old running late for school. She appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, her auburn hair, so much like her mother's, pulled back in a messy ponytail. Dark circles under her brown eyes spoke of another restless night, though she'd never admit to the nightmares that still visited her dreams. Emma had grown 3 inches in the past year, as if grief had stretched her toward adulthood too quickly. She moved with Sarah's grace, but carried Eli's stubborn set to her jaw. The combination made her beautiful in a way that terrified him, especially when she looked at him with disappointment that cut deeper than any criticism from his neighbors. "Check the dining room table," Eli said, refilling his mug. "You were working on that Civil War project last night." She disappeared and returned with the notebook, shooting him a look that mixed gratitude with embarrassment. Their relationship had become a careful dance of small kindnesses and unspoken tensions, both of them trying to navigate a world that felt fundamentally changed without Sarah's steady presence. "Mrs. Henderson called again yesterday," Emma said, shouldering her backpack. "About the mortgage." Eli's jaw tightened. At 16, Emma shouldn't know about mortgage payments or past due notices, but poverty had a way of stripping away the luxury of childhood innocence. "I'll handle it." "With what money?" The question hung in the air between them, brutal in its honesty. Emma's face immediately softened with regret. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean—" "I know." He reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "I'm working on it." She nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Emma had inherited Sarah's practical nature along with her beauty, and she understood their situation better than Eli sometimes wished. The factory job that had supported them for 15 years had vanished, along with the rest of Millbrook's manufacturing base. His unemployment benefits had run out 2 months ago, and the savings Sarah had carefully built up during her years as a school secretary had been consumed by medical bills and funeral expenses. After Emma left for school, Eli walked through the house that had once felt like a sanctuary and now felt more like a shrine. He paused at the mantelpiece, where a photograph of Sarah smiled at him from their wedding day. She wore her grandmother's dress and carried wildflowers from their neighbor's garden because they couldn't afford a professional bouquet. She'd been beautiful, but more than that, she'd been steady, the kind of woman who could stretch $1 until it screamed and still make their small house feel like a palace. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," he whispered to the photograph. "I'm failing her." The silence that answered him felt heavy with judgment. Sarah would have known exactly how to handle their financial crisis. She would have found a way to make their situation work without sacrificing Emma's future or their family's dignity. Instead, Emma was stuck with a father who had spent his career following other people's instructions and now found himself lost without a roadmap. The phone rang, interrupting his self-recrimination. The caller ID showed Henderson's scrapyard, and Eli felt his heart skip. Old Jim Henderson had called 3 days ago about something he thought might interest Eli, something about his father's railroad days. "Eli," Jim Henderson, "you still thinking about what we talked about?" "I'm still thinking." Eli had been doing more than thinking. He'd been lying awake at night, turning Jim's words over in his mind, like stones in a river. "Well, I got another buyer coming to look at her tomorrow. Railroad enthusiast from Chicago with deep pockets. If you want her, you better come today." Eli closed his eyes. $3,000. It was everything he had left in their checking account, money that should go toward the mortgage payment due in 2 weeks. Money that represented the difference between keeping their home and joining the growing number of Millbrook families who'd lost everything. But something in his chest pulled tight when he thought about letting that locomotive disappear into some collector's private museum. His father, Thomas Mercer, had worked the railroad for 43 years before a heart attack took him when Eli was 25. Thomas had been a quiet man who spoke in practical terms about practical things, but sometimes, usually late at night when he thought his son was sleeping, Eli had heard him talking to himself about trains that carried more than freight and secrets that died with the men who kept them. "I'll be there in an hour," Eli heard himself say. Henderson's scrapyard occupied 10 acres of what had once been prime farmland on the outskirts of Millbrook. Generations of discarded dreams rusted under the Indiana sky, abandoned cars, obsolete farm equipment, and the remnants of the town's industrial past. Jim Henderson had inherited the business from his father and had been buying and selling scrap for 30 years, developing an eye for what had value and what was simply junk. The locomotive sat on a section of track behind the main office, looking like a sleeping giant. Engine 447 had been built in 1943, according to the faded numbers still visible on her side. She was a Baltimore, Ohio freight engine designed for hauling heavy loads across the Midwest during the war years. Now rust covered her black paint like a reddish beard, and weeds grew up through the gaps in her undercarriage. "She's been sitting here for 2 years, Jim said, walking around the engine with the reverence of a man who appreciated good craftsmanship. Bought her from the B.O. when they were scrapping the old steam engines, always meant to restore her. But hell, I'm 73 years old. What am I going to do with a locomotive?" Eli ran his hand along the engine's side, feeling the rough texture of rust flakes and old paint. Something about touching the metal made his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. "You said she reminded you of my father?" Tom worked on engines like this during the war. He had a way with the old steam engines that the younger guys never quite mastered. Jim's weathered face creased with memory. He used to say these engines had souls, said if you listened close enough, they'd tell you their stories. 3,000? Cash money, and I'll throw in that section of track she's sitting on, about 50 feet of rails and ties, enough to make her look proper. Eli walked around the locomotive slowly, taking in her condition. The boiler looked solid despite the rust, and her wheels were still true on the rails. With enough work and money, more money than he had, she could probably be restored to running condition. But that wasn't what drew him to her. Something about the way she sat on those tracks, patient and waiting, reminded him of his father's stories about trains that carried hope through the darkest days of the war. She runs? Last time anyone tried was 15 years ago. Boiler's been cold since then, but the mechanics are sound. Your dad would have loved working on her. Eli thought about Emma's practical questions and his own practical concerns. $3,000 could buy 3 months of mortgage payments or groceries for the rest of the year, or 1,000 other things they actually needed. But when he looked at engine 447, he didn't see a piece of scrap metal. He saw his father's hands moving with practiced precision over similar machinery, heard his father's voice talking about trains that carried secrets and stories that outlived the men who lived them. "I'll take her." The transaction took an hour. Jim Henderson handled the paperwork with the efficiency of a man who had sold thousands of pieces of discarded dreams over the decades. Eli signed the title transfer and wrote a check that left their checking account with $47.32. By the time he drove home, word of his purchase had already spread through Millbrook's efficient gossip network. Mrs. Patterson from the post office was in her front yard when he pulled into his driveway. She gave him a look that mixed pity with disbelief, the same look she'd worn at Sarah's funeral when she thought no one was watching. 2 houses down, Bob Miller was washing his truck and pretending not to stare, but Eli could feel the weight of his neighbor's judgment. Emma was waiting in the kitchen when he walked through the door. Her school books were spread across the table, but her attention was focused entirely on him. "Jenny Patterson says you bought a train, a locomotive. With what money?" The question carried the same brutal honesty as the morning's conversation, but now it was sharpened with something that looked like betrayal. Eli sat down across from her, suddenly feeling older than his 42 years. "I know how it sounds." "It sounds crazy." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "Dad, we can't pay the mortgage, and you just spent $3,000 on a piece of junk that doesn't even run." "It's not junk." The words came out more sharply than he intended. "Your grandfather. Grandpa's been dead for 17 years. Emma's composure finally cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "He's not coming back, and neither is Mom, and buying some stupid train isn't going to bring either of them back." She ran upstairs, leaving Eli alone with the weight of his decision and the echo of her footsteps overhead. Through the kitchen window, he could see Bob Miller still pretending to wash his truck while actually keeping watch on the Mercer house, no doubt gathering details for tomorrow's coffee shop conversations. That evening, after Emma had locked herself in her room with her homework and her anger, Eli drove back to Henderson's scrapyard. The locomotive looked different in the fading daylight, less like a discarded piece of machinery and more like something waiting patiently for its purpose to be revealed. He climbed up into the engine cab and sat in the engineer's seat, trying to imagine his father in this same position during the war years. The cab smelled of rust and old grease, but underneath those scents was something else, something that reminded him of his father's workshop. Days of Saturday mornings spent learning to use tools and listening to stories about the importance of honest work. Thomas Mercer had been a man who believed in the value of things that lasted, who could look at a broken piece of machinery and see not junk, but potential. "I hope you know what you're doing, Dad," Eli whispered to the gathering darkness. But as he sat in that silent locomotive, surrounded by the ghosts of his father's world, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond paying bills and getting through each day. He didn't know yet what that purpose might be, but for the first time in months, he was ready to find out. 3 days after buying the locomotive, Eli found himself climbing into the attic above the garage, searching for his father's old toolbox. The wooden ladder creaked under his weight as he navigated between boxes of Christmas decorations and forgotten childhood memories. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that managed to penetrate the small window, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere in the cramped space. He'd been putting off this moment, knowing that opening his father's things would bring back memories he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But if he was going to work on engine 447, he needed proper tools, the kind of specialized wrenches and gauges that railroad men had used for generations. The toolbox sat in the far corner, exactly where he'd placed it after cleaning out his father's workshop 17 years ago. It was a large metal chest-painted forest green with T. Mercer, B.O. Railroad stenciled in white letters across the top. Beside it sat a smaller wooden box that Eli didn't immediately recognize, and an old kerosene lantern with a brass base and glass chimney that had somehow escaped tarnishing despite the years. He pulled the lantern closer, remembering suddenly how his father had carried it during their nighttime walks around the rail yard when Eli was young. Thomas had always insisted that electric flashlights were too harsh, that the soft glow of kerosene allowed a man to see what really mattered without overwhelming his night vision. "Railroad lantern shows you the truth," his father had said. "Electric light just shows you what's there." Opening the wooden box revealed his father's personal effects: a pocket watch, some old photographs, and Thomas's leather-bound Bible. Eli lifted the Bible carefully, surprised by its weight. His father had read from it every night before bed, but Eli had never really examined it closely. As he opened the cover, a folded piece of paper fell out, landing on the dusty attic floor. The paper was yellowed with age and felt brittle between his fingers. In his father's careful handwriting, he read, "Engine 447, Agen B, O Freight, built March 1943. Special cargo manifest, Operation Safekeeping. What the war couldn't take, the railroad kept. Look for the modifications behind the false panel. The truth is worth more than gold, but it belongs to those who lost everything. Thomas Mercer, 1978. Eli read the note 3 times, his heart beating faster with each reading. Engine 447, the same number as the locomotive, sitting in Henderson's scrapyard. His father had known this specific train, had written about it with the kind of careful precision he brought to everything important in his life. "Dad," Emma's voice called from below. "What are you doing up there?" "Looking for Grandpa's tools," Eli called back, carefully folding the note and slipping it into his shirt pocket. He climbed down with the toolbox and lantern, trying to process what he'd just discovered. Emma was waiting in the garage, still wearing her school uniform, but with her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than 16. "Jenny's mom says the whole town is talking about you buying that train. She says people think you've lost your mind." "People have always talked." Eli set the toolbox on his workbench and began examining the tools inside. Each one was wrapped in oiled cloth, perfectly preserved after nearly 2 decades of storage. "Your grandfather used to say that the only opinions that mattered were the ones that came from people who understood what you were trying to accomplish." "What are you trying to accomplish?" Emma's question was direct but not accusatory this time. Something in her tone suggested she genuinely wanted to understand. Eli pulled the note from his pocket and handed it to her. "I've found this in your grandfather's Bible." Emma read it twice, her eyebrows drawing together in concentration. "Engine 447, that's the same number as the locomotive I bought." "Yes. What's Operation Safekeeping?" "I don't know. But your grandfather wrote this note 30 years after the war ended. That means he was still thinking about it, still keeping track of that specific train." Emma looked up from the note, and for the first time since he'd bought the locomotive, her expression held curiosity instead of anger. "You think there's really something hidden in it?" "I think your grandfather was the most honest man I've ever known, and he wouldn't have written something like this unless it was true." That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Eli drove to the scrapyard with his father's tools and the kerosene lantern. The locomotive looked different in the darkness, more imposing somehow, as if the weight of mystery had given it new substance. He climbed into the engine cab and lit the lantern, adjusting the wick until it cast a warm, steady glow. The note had mentioned modifications behind a false panel. Eli began examining every surface in the cab, running his hands along the walls and checking for irregularities. The soft light from the lantern revealed details he'd missed during his daylight inspection, scratches in the metal that looked deliberate, slight variations in the paint that suggested some surfaces had been repainted. Behind the engineer's seat, he found what he was looking for. A section of the back wall that looked identical to the rest, but sounded hollow when he tapped it with his knuckles. The metal panel was held in place by bolts that had been painted over to match the surrounding surface, but the paint was slightly newer, applied over rust that had already formed. Using his father's tools, Eli carefully removed the bolts. The panel came away to reveal a hidden compartment about the size of a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, was a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs. His hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope. The first document was a cargo manifest, dated April 15, 1943, listing the contents of a shipment from Baltimore Processing Center to Midwest Distribution Point, classification. Restricted. Below that was a list of items that made no immediate sense. Personal effects, category A through M, artwork, classification pending, precious metals, assay required, documents, historical significance. Beneath the manifest were photographs, dozens of them in black and white. Some showed railroad workers loading wooden crates into freight cars. Others showed the interior of warehouses filled with paintings, sculptures, and what looked like religious artifacts. And in several of the photographs, Eli recognized his father's young face among the workers. One photograph, in particular, caught his attention. It showed Thomas Mercer standing beside engine 447, but the locomotive looked different, newer, with modifications to the cargo area that weren't visible on the current engine. His father was holding something in his hands, though the photograph was too dark to make out what it was. At the bottom of the envelope was a letter written in his father's handwriting, but this one was addressed to Eli. Son, if you're reading this, it means you found the locomotive and understood enough to look for the truth. What we did during the war was necessary, but it was also incomplete. The government asked us to transport recovered assets, things the Nazis had stolen from families across Europe. Some of it made it back to the rightful owners. Some of it didn't. Engine 447 was part of a network that kept these items safe until they could be properly returned. I was supposed to finish the job, but life got in the way. The items are still out there, still waiting. If you choose to continue what I started, remember that this isn't about money. It's about returning what was stolen to people who lost everything. The map is in the firebox, behind the brick on the right side. Be careful who you trust. Some people are still looking for what we hid. Thomas Mercer. Eli sat in the locomotive cab for a long time, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls as he processed what he'd discovered. His father hadn't just worked on trains during the war, he'd been part of something larger, something that connected to the darkest chapter of the 20th century and the ongoing effort to repair some of its damage. The next morning, Pete Morrison found him still sitting in the locomotive. Pete was Millbrook's main mechanic, a man who could fix anything with an engine, and who had known Thomas Mercer well enough to consider him a friend. "Heard you were out here all night," Pete said, climbing into the cab with the ease of someone who had spent time around trains. "Emma called my shop looking for you." She was worried. "Pete, what do you know about my father's work during the war?" Pete's expression grew cautious. Tom was a good railroad man, worked harder than most, kept to himself more than some. "That's not what I'm asking." Pete was quiet for a long moment, studying Eli's face in the morning light. "What did you find?" Eli showed him the documents and photographs. Pete examined them carefully, his weathered hands gentle with the aging paper. When he finished reading, he handed everything back and sat back against the locomotive's wall. "Your father never told you about the special trains?" "Special trains?" During the war, the railroad carried a lot of things that weren't on the regular manifests. Government cargo, military supplies, things that needed to disappear from one place and reappear somewhere else without anyone asking questions. Pete's voice was careful, measured, Tom was one of the engineers they trusted with the sensitive shipments. This cargo manifest talks about personal effects and artwork. That doesn't sound like military supplies. No, it doesn't. Pete was quiet again, and Eli could see him weighing how much to reveal. There were rumors, after the war. Stories about trainloads of stuff that the Nazis had stolen from Jewish families in Europe. Paintings, jewelry, religious items. The government recovered some of it, but returning it to the rightful owners was complicated. A lot of the families were dead. Others had scattered across the world. So they hid it. They were supposed to catalog it, research it, find the families if they could. But the war ended. People had other priorities, and a lot of it just sat in warehouses gathering dust. Pete looked directly at Eli. Some of the railroad men who had transported it thought that wasn't right. They thought if the government wasn't going to finish the job, maybe someone else should. Someone like my father. I'm not saying your father did anything illegal. I'm just saying he was the kind of man who believed in finishing what he started, especially when it came to doing right by people who had suffered. Eli thought about the letter his father had left for him, about the unfinished mission and the items still waiting to be returned to their rightful owners. Pete, if someone wanted to continue that work today, hypothetically, what would they need to know? Pete smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Hypothetically, they'd need to understand that some secrets are worth keeping, and some promises are worth keeping, even if they take decades to fulfill. He paused, looking around the locomotive cab with appreciation. They'd also need to know that they wouldn't be doing it alone. Some of us have been waiting a long time for Tom's son to figure out what his father left for him. The revelation that Pete Morrison knew about his father's wartime activities changed everything for Eli. Over the next few days, he found himself looking at his hometown with new eyes, wondering who else might be keeping decades-old secrets. But first, he needed to examine the locomotive more thoroughly, and that meant understanding exactly what modifications his father and his colleagues had made to engine 447. Working by the light of his father's kerosene lantern, Eli began a systematic inspection of the locomotive's brake system. What he found confirmed Pete's hints about the special nature of this particular engine. The brake mechanism had been modified in ways that made no sense for normal freight operations. Additional airlines had been installed, creating a secondary braking system that could be operated independently of the main controls. "This is brilliant," Pete said when Eli showed him the modifications. "With this setup, you could stop specific cars without affecting the rest of the train. If you were carrying sensitive cargo that needed to be dropped off at unmarked locations, this would let you do it without the rest of the crew knowing." Emma had started joining them in the evenings, bringing homework and a thermos of coffee while asking increasingly sophisticated questions about the locomotive's unusual features. Her initial embarrassment about her father's purchase had transformed into genuine curiosity, especially after she'd spent several nights researching World War II railroad operations on the internet. "I found something," she announced one evening, spreading printed pages across the locomotive's floor. There was a program called the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives Unit. The Monuments Men. They were responsible for recovering stolen artwork and cultural artifacts that the Nazis had looted from occupied countries. Eli examined the documents she'd printed. The official program had ended in the early 1950s, but Emma had found references to ongoing efforts to locate and return stolen items well into the 1960s and beyond. "Look at this." Emma pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. It says that railroad networks were often used to transport recovered items because they were more secure than truck shipments and easier to track than individual vehicles. But it also says that some railroad crews became personally invested in the mission and continued working on returns even after the official program ended. "That sounds like Grandpa," Emma continued. "Mom always said he couldn't leave a job unfinished, even if it took him years to complete it. The brake system wasn't the only modification they discovered. The locomotive's coal tender had been fitted with hidden compartments accessible only from the inside, and the firebox contained a removable brick that concealed a space large enough to hold documents or small valuables. Each discovery reinforced the picture of Engine 447 as something far more significant than a simple freight locomotive. But their investigation was beginning to attract attention they didn't want. Twice in the past week, Eli had noticed the same sedan with Illinois plates parked on different streets around town, always positioned where the driver could observe the rail yard. When he mentioned it to Pete, the older man's expression grew serious. "Could be railroad enthusiasts," Pete said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Or it could be people who have been waiting a long time for Engine 447 to surface." "What kind of people?" "The kind who believe they have a rightful claim to what your father and his friends were hiding." That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with his father's documents spread before him, trying to piece together the scope of what Thomas Mercer had been involved in. The photograph showed railroad operations across multiple states, suggesting a network that extended far beyond Millbrook. The manifest listed dozens of shipments over a period of several years, each one containing items described in careful but cryptic language. One photograph in particular troubled him. It showed his father standing with 3 other railroad men beside a freight car. The men's faces were serious, almost grim, and they were surrounded by wooden crates marked with symbols Eli didn't recognize. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Last shipment, April 1947. Network disbanded. Items secure pending resolution." 1. That was 4 years after the locomotive had been built, 2 years after the war had ended. His father had continued this work long after most people had moved on to peacetime concerns. The commitment suggested something deeper than professional duty. It suggested a personal mission that had shaped the rest of Thomas Mercer's life. Emma found him still sitting at the table when she came down for breakfast. "Dad, did you sleep at all?" "Not much." He showed her the photograph. "I'm trying to understand how big this operation was and why it mattered so much to your grandfather." Emma studied the image carefully. "These crates look different from the ones in the other photographs. See how they're marked with those symbols?" She was right. The symbols looked like Hebrew letters, though Eli couldn't be sure. "What do you think they mean?" "I think they mean Grandpa wasn't just moving random stolen artwork. I think he was specifically helping Jewish families get their belongings back." Emma's voice was soft with realization. "Dad, what if this wasn't just about recovering stolen property? What if it was about trying to restore what the Holocaust had taken from people?" The possibility hit Eli like a physical blow. If Emma was right, his father hadn't just been a railroad man following orders. He'd been part of a network dedicated to repairing one of history's greatest injustices. The weight of that responsibility, carried for decades without recognition or support, began to explain why Thomas Mercer had been so careful about keeping secrets and so insistent that some work was too important to abandon. "There's something else," Emma said, pulling a piece of paper from her backpack. "I found this article about families who are still looking for items that were stolen during the war. There are organizations that help with the research, databases of missing artwork and family heirlooms. Some of these families have been searching for 70 years. Eli read the article, which detailed the ongoing efforts of Holocaust survivors and their descendants to recover family treasures that had disappeared during the war. The stories were heartbreaking wedding rings that had been in families for generations, paintings that represented a lifetime of artistic achievement, religious artifacts that connected families to centuries of tradition. "If what Grandpa hid is connected to these families," Emma said, "then maybe we have a responsibility to help finish what he started." That afternoon, Eli and Emma drove to the library to research the organizations Emma had found online. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian, proved to be an unexpected resource. She remembered the war years clearly and had vivid recollections of the unusual railroad activity that had characterized the period. There were trains coming through here all the time that weren't on the regular schedules, she said, leading them to a section of local history materials. Military shipments, they said, but some of us wondered why military cargo needed to be unloaded so secretly. Your father was always very careful about who he talked to and what he said about his work. She pulled out a collection of local newspapers from the 1940s. These might help you understand what was happening during those years. The newspapers painted a picture of a community deeply involved in the war effort, with local factories converted to military production and the railroad serving as a crucial supply line. But between the lines of the official stories, Eli began to see hints of the more secretive operations Pete had described. References to special government shipments and classified cargo appeared regularly, always without details, but with a frequency that suggested significant activity. One article from 1946 caught his attention. It described a ceremony honoring local railroad workers for their distinguished service to the nation during the war years. Thomas Mercer was listed among those honored, along with a dozen other men whose names Eli didn't recognize. "Mrs. Patterson," Eli said, "do you remember any of these other men who were honored with my father?" She examined the list carefully. "Oh my, yes. Most of them have passed on now, but I remember them well. They were all railroad men, and they all seemed to work the same kinds of special assignments your father handled." She paused, her eyes growing distant with memory. "You know, they used to meet sometimes, even years after the war ended. Quiet gatherings at Pete Morrison's garage or at the rail yard. They said they were just old railroad men sharing stories, but there was something more serious about those meetings." Pete Morrison was part of this? Pete's father was. Pete inherited more than just mechanical skills from his father. He inherited some responsibilities too. That evening, Eli confronted Pete directly. "You've known all along what my father was involved in." Pete nodded slowly. "I've been waiting 30 years for you to ask the right questions. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because some knowledge is dangerous, and some responsibilities are too heavy to carry unless you choose them willingly." Pete looked at the locomotive, its metal surface gleaming in the light from their work lamps. "Your father left instructions that if anything happened to him, I was to wait for you to find your own way to the truth. He believed that if you were meant to continue his work, you'd figure it out on your own." "Continue his work how?" Pete smiled grimly. "By finding what he hid, researching who it belongs to, and making sure it gets back to the right families. There are items worth millions of dollars hidden in locations your father established across 3 states. Maps, documentation, provenance, records, everything needed to complete the returns he started. And if I choose not to continue, then the secret dies with us, and families who have been searching for their heritage for 70 years will never find what they're looking for." Pete paused. "But I don't think that's the kind of man you are, Eli. I think you're exactly the kind of man your father hoped you'd become." The next breakthrough came when Emma discovered the coal tender's false bottom. She had been measuring the external dimensions of the tender against its internal capacity when she noticed a discrepancy of nearly 6 inches. Working together with careful precision, they found the hidden release mechanism and lifted away a section of flooring that had been disguised to look like a permanent part of the structure. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas and sealed in a waterproof container, was a collection of documents that took Eli's breath away. The wartime supply manifest was far more detailed than the one they'd found earlier, listing not just general categories of items, but specific pieces with detailed descriptions and, in many cases, photographs. "Dad, look at this," Emma whispered, holding up a photograph of an ornate silver menorah. Attached to it was a typed description: "Ceremonial menorah, silver with semi-precious stones, belonged to the Rosenberg family of Vienna. Seized March 1938 during Anschluss operations. Current status: Recovered, awaiting family location. The manifest contained dozens of similar entries, wedding rings with detailed engravings, paintings by artists whose names Eli didn't recognize, but whose work was obviously valuable. Religious texts written in Hebrew and other languages he couldn't identify. Each item was catalogued with the same careful attention to detail, as if whoever had compiled the list understood that these objects represented more than their monetary value. But it was the accompanying document that revealed the true scope of what Thomas Mercer had undertaken, titled Project Sanctuary, Phase 2 Implementation. It outlined a network of railroad men across the Midwest who had committed to continuing the work of returning stolen items to Holocaust survivors and their families long after the official government programs had ended. "This is incredible," Emma said, reading over his shoulder. "Grandpa wasn't working alone. There were railroad workers in Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, all coordinating to move these items safely and research their proper ownership." The document included a hand-drawn map showing locations across 3 states where items had been hidden pending resolution of ownership questions. Some locations were marked as resolved, with dates in the 1950s and 1960s. Others remained unmarked, suggesting they still contained unreturned items. "Emma," Eli said slowly, "I think we're looking at something worth millions of dollars. But more than that, we're looking at the life's work of men who believed that some wrongs were too important to leave uncorrected." That evening brought both hope and concern. Emma had spent hours online researching organizations that helped Holocaust survivors locate missing family possessions. She'd found contact information for 3 different groups, including one based in Washington that maintained a database of recovered items still seeking their rightful owners. "I think we should reach out to them," Emma said. "If we're going to do this right, we need expert help with the research and authentication." But their research had also revealed a troubling possibility. Among the online forums dedicated to recovering Holocaust assets, they'd found posts from people claiming to represent the families of Nazi officers who had been unjustly deprived of items they considered family property. The language was carefully legal, but the intent was clear. There were people actively searching for the same hidden assets that Thomas Mercer and his network had spent decades protecting. "We need to be careful who we contact," Eli said. "If word gets out that we've found documentation of hidden items, we might attract the wrong kind of attention." His concern proved justified the next morning when he arrived at the rail yard to find clear evidence that someone had been searching the locomotive during the night. Nothing had been damaged, but tools had been moved, and the hidden compartments they'd discovered showed signs of being examined by someone who knew what they were looking for. Pete Morrison arrived 30 minutes later, took one look at the locomotive, and immediately understood what had happened. "We're not the only ones who know about engine 447, he said grimly, "and we're probably not the only ones who have copies of the documentation." "What do you mean?" "Your father was careful, but he wasn't the only man involved in this network. When the operation was disbanded in 1947, each location was supposed to destroy their copies of the master list. But some of the railroad men kept copies, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case someone needed to finish the job someday, or in case someone needed to protect the hiding places from people who had no right to them." Pete examined the locomotive more carefully, checking each hidden compartment for signs of tampering. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. They found the brake system modifications, the coal tender compartment, even the firebox hiding place. But they didn't take anything. Maybe they didn't find what they were looking for. Or maybe they were just confirming that this is the right locomotive before they make their real move. The bank notice arrived that afternoon, delivered by certified mail with Emma's signature required. Eli read it twice before the words fully registered. They had 2 weeks to bring their mortgage current or face foreclosure proceedings. The amount due was more than he could possibly raise through conventional means. Emma read the notice over his shoulder, her face growing pale. "Dad, what are we going to do?" Eli looked at the manifest they'd found, with its careful documentation of items potentially worth millions of dollars. The temptation was almost overwhelming. If even a fraction of what his father had hidden was still recoverable, it could solve their immediate financial problems and secure Emma's future. But the letters and documents made clear that these items belonged to specific families, people who had already lost everything once and were still searching for the pieces of their lives that had survived. "We're going to do the right thing," he said finally. "We're going to find out who these items belong to and make sure they get returned. Even if it means we lose our house? Your grandfather spent 30 years protecting other people's heritage. I'm not going to dishonor that by treating his life's work like a treasure hunt." Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady with resolve. "Then we better work fast. If there are people looking for what Grandpa hid, and if we're running out of time to save our house, then we need to find those items and get them to the right families before someone else gets to them first." That evening, they made their first contact with the outside world. Emma had found the email address for Dr. Margaret Chase, a historian at Georgetown University who specialized in Holocaust asset recovery. Her online biography indicated she had worked with families around the world to locate and return stolen artwork and family heirlooms. Emma composed a careful email explaining that they had discovered documentation related to a post-war network that had been involved in protecting recovered Nazi loot pending return to rightful owners. She included photographs of 2 items from the manifest, the silver menorah and a painting described as Portrait of Rebecca, oil on canvas, signed I. Goldstein, belonged to the Goldstein family of Prague. The response came within 6 hours. Dr. Chase wrote that both items were listed in databases of missing Holocaust assets and that she would be willing to travel to Indiana to examine the documentation in person. She also included a warning: "Be very careful about who else you contact regarding this material. There are individuals and organizations who have been seeking these items for decades, not all of them with legitimate claims or honorable intentions." 2 days later, Dr. Margaret Chase arrived in Millbrook, driving a rented sedan and carrying a briefcase full of authentication equipment. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She examined the locomotive with the appreciation of someone who understood both history and engineering, asking detailed questions about the modifications and taking photographs of the hidden compartments. But it was her reaction to the documents that convinced Eli they had discovered something truly significant. Dr. Chase studied each page with intense concentration, occasionally making notes or cross-referencing items with information from her laptop computer. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "I've been working in this field for 25 years, and I've never seen documentation this complete from the informal networks that operated after the war. Your father and his colleagues kept records that rival anything the government produced. How many of these items are still missing?" "At least 60% of what's listed here. Some families have been searching for these specific pieces for decades." She looked up from the manifest with something approaching awe. "If even half of the locations marked on this map still contain what your father hid there, you're looking at the largest recovery of Holocaust assets in the past 30 years. Emma leaned forward. "What do we need to do to return them to the right families?" "First, we authenticate everything. Then we research current family members and verify claims. Finally, we arrange for secure transportation and legal transfer." Dr. Chase paused. "But I have to warn you, this process can take months or even years for complicated cases. And you'll need to be prepared for the possibility that some people will challenge your right to make these returns." "What kind of people?" "Descendants of Nazi officials who claim family ownership, art dealers who argue they purchased items legally from previous owners, museums or private collectors who believe they have legitimate title." Dr. Chase's expression grew serious. "And unfortunately, some individuals who see Holocaust asset recovery as an opportunity for personal profit rather than historical justice. Eli thought about the sedan with Illinois plates and the evidence that someone had searched the locomotive. Dr. Chase, if someone wanted to prevent these items from being returned to their rightful owners, what would they do? They'd try to get to them first. They'd claim legal ownership through forged documents or dubious purchase agreements. Or they'd simply take them and disappear, knowing that most families don't have the resources to pursue international legal challenges. Then we better move fast. Dr. Chase smiled for the first time since arriving. Mr. Mercer, I think your father would be very proud of the man you've become. And I think we're about to give some families the greatest gift they could ever receive, the return of their heritage and the knowledge that someone cared enough to protect it for 70 years. The discovery of the Wehrmacht officers' personal effects changed everything about their understanding of Engine 447's wartime role. Hidden behind a false panel in the engineer's cab that required removing 3 different sections of equipment to access, they found a collection of German military items that told a story none of them had expected. The effects were wrapped in the same oiled canvas as the other documents, but these materials were different in both origin and implication. Nazi military medals, including an Iron Cross and several campaign ribbons, photographs of German officers in dress uniform, personal letters written in Gothic script that none of them could read, and most significantly, official Wehrmacht documents bearing stamps and signatures that looked authentic even to untrained eyes. This doesn't make sense, Emma said, examining a photograph that showed a German officer standing beside what was clearly Engine 447, though the locomotive looked different, cleaner, more military in its appointments. Why would Grandpa have kept Nazi materials with the stolen Jewish artifacts? Dr. Chase studied the items with the careful attention of someone who had seen similar collections before. These aren't trophies, she said finally. These are evidence. Look at the dates on these documents and compare them to the dates on your father's manifest. The dates told a story that was both more complex and more disturbing than anything they had imagined. The German materials dated from 1943 to 1945, covering the period when Engine 447 had been used for its original purpose. But the American documentation began in 1945 and continued into the late 1940s, suggesting that the locomotive had been captured along with its cargo and crew. I think Engine 447 was originally a German train, Dr. Chase explained. The Nazis used specially modified locomotives to transport stolen artwork and valuables from occupied territories back to Germany. When the Allies captured these trains, they found not just the stolen items but also the German personnel responsible for the operations. Emma pulled up information on her laptop about Nazi art theft operations. There were special SS units responsible for looting cultural artifacts from Jewish families and museums. They used the railroad system to move everything back to Germany for storage or distribution to Nazi officials. So this locomotive was captured with its cargo intact? It looks that way. And your father's network inherited the responsibility for sorting out what belonged to whom and returning it to the rightful owners. Dr. Chase handled one of the German documents carefully. These personal effects probably belonged to the officer who was commanding the transport when it was captured. Keeping them with the other materials would have been important for establishing the provenance of the stolen items. The implications were staggering. Engine 447 hadn't just been used to transport recovered Holocaust assets. It had been the original vehicle used to steal them. The locomotive sitting in Henderson's scrapyard was a direct link to one of the most systematic art theft operations in human history. But the discovery raised new questions about the people who had been watching them. If descendants of Nazi officials knew about the locomotive's history, they might believe they had legitimate claims to items their relatives had acquired during the war. The thought that Emma and he might be confronting people with such connections made Eli's stomach tighten with anxiety. Dr. Chase, he said, if someone wanted to claim ownership of these items based on their family's Nazi connections, would they have any legal standing? Absolutely not. International law is very clear that items stolen during the Holocaust remain the property of their original owners or their heirs, regardless of subsequent transactions. She paused. But that doesn't stop people from trying, especially when the amounts involved are significant. Some will use intimidation, others will file frivolous lawsuits hoping to delay returns, and some will simply try to steal the items before legitimate claims can be processed. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the rail yard. Through the locomotive's windows, they could see the same Illinois sedan that had been spotted around town, now parked directly beside the tracks. Two men in expensive suits got out and began walking toward engine 447 with the confident stride of people who believed they belonged there. "Dr. Chase," Eli said quietly, "I think we're about to meet some of those people you were warning us about." The older of the two men was in his 60s, well-dressed and carrying himself with military bearing despite his civilian clothes. His companion was younger, perhaps 40, with the kind of intense focus that suggested either legal training or law enforcement background. They approached the locomotive without hesitation, as if they had every right to examine it. "Excuse me," the older man called out. "I'm looking for Mr. Eli Mercer. I believe he's the current owner of this locomotive." Eli climbed down from the cab, leaving Dr. Chase and Emma inside with the sensitive documents. "I'm Eli Mercer. Can I help you?" "My name is Heinrich Müller, and this is my associate, Mr. Brennan. We represent certain parties who have a legitimate interest in this locomotive and any materials that might be associated with it." The accent was faint but distinctly German, and the way Müller's eyes swept over the locomotive suggested familiarity with its history. "We understand that you've discovered some items that belonged to my family during the war years, items that were taken from us without proper legal process." "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Eli said carefully. Brennan stepped forward, his demeanor more aggressive than his companions. "Mr. Mercer, we have documentation proving that this locomotive was used to transport property belonging to the Müller family. Property that was confiscated by American forces in 1945 without compensation or due process." "What kind of property?" Müller reached into his briefcase and produced a folder containing what appeared to be official documents. Artwork, jewelry, religious artifacts, and family heirlooms that had been in the Müller family for generations. When the Americans captured the transport train, they seized everything without distinguishing between legitimate family possessions and items that may have been acquired through other means. The claim was delivered with such confidence that for a moment Eli wondered if there might be some truth to it. But then he remembered the photographs and documents Dr. Chase had authenticated, the careful records his father had kept, and the detailed provenance information that proved these items had been stolen from Jewish families. "Do you have documentation proving your family's ownership of specific items?" "We have sufficient documentation to establish our legal rights," Brennan said. "What we need now is cooperation in locating and recovering the items that belong to our clients." Emma appeared in the locomotive's doorway, and Eli could see that she had been listening to the conversation. Her expression was a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that reminded him strongly of her mother when Sarah had encountered someone she didn't trust. "Dad," she said loudly enough for Müller and Brennan to hear, "Dr. Chase wants to know if these gentlemen have appointments. She says she's working with several organizations that track fraudulent claims against Holocaust assets." The effect on Müller was immediate and telling. His composed demeanor slipped for just a moment, revealing something much harder underneath. "Dr. Chase is here." "You know her?" "Dr. Chase has interfered with several legitimate recovery efforts in the past. She has a tendency to side with claimants whose documentation is less than complete while refusing to acknowledge clear legal ownership by families who can prove their rights." Dr. Chase emerged from the locomotive cab, and her expression when she saw Müller was anything but friendly. Heinrich Müller, I should have known you'd eventually surface here. Margaret, still playing protector to people who can't prove their claims. Still representing people who think they can legitimize theft through legal paperwork? The tension between them was immediate and personal, suggesting a history that went beyond professional disagreement. Eli found himself caught between two groups of people who clearly knew more about the situation than he did. "Dr. Chase," Eli said, "perhaps you could explain what's going on here." Mr. Müller represents a network of people who claim their families were wrongfully deprived of property during the war. They filed claims against recovered Holocaust assets, hoping to delay or prevent returns to actual victims. She faced Müller directly. What they don't mention is that their family property was originally stolen from Jewish families who were murdered or displaced during the Holocaust. Müller's response was swift and practiced. That's Dr. Chase's interpretation. The legal reality is that many items were acquired through legitimate transactions during the war years, transactions that were later ignored by occupying forces who assumed everything had been stolen. Legitimate transactions, Dr. Chase repeated with contempt. You mean sales forced on Jewish families at gunpoint, or purchases from SS officers who had confiscated items from people being sent to concentration camps? Brennan stepped forward again, apparently deciding that diplomacy had failed. "Mr. Mercer, we're prepared to make you a substantial offer for any items you may have found. Our clients are willing to pay well above market value to recover their family's property." The offer was tempting in a way that made Eli's chest tighten with guilt. Emma's college fund, their mortgage, their entire financial future could be secured with a single transaction. But the photographs of concentration camp victims wearing the jewelry, now being claimed by Müller's clients, made the moral choice clear. "I appreciate your offer," Eli said, "but I'm not interested in selling anything. If we find items that belong to specific families, we'll work to return them to the rightful owners." Müller's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "Mr. Mercer, you're making a serious mistake. The items you're protecting belong to people who are no longer alive to claim them. Their families are scattered around the world, if they even exist. You're choosing to preserve museum pieces instead of providing for your own family's future. How do you know about my family situation?" "Small towns talk, Mr. Mercer. Everyone knows about your financial difficulties and your daughter's need for college funding. We're offering you a practical solution to real problems." The fact that these strangers had researched his personal finances made Eli angry in a way that surprised him with its intensity. "I think you should leave." Brennan reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "When you change your mind, and you will change your mind, call this number. Our offer won't remain open indefinitely." After they left, Dr. Chase sat down heavily on the locomotive steps. "Eli, I need to tell you something. Heinrich Müller isn't just representing clients with questionable claims. He's the grandson of SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Müller, who was one of the officers responsible for art looting operations in occupied France and Poland. His grandfather was a Nazi? One of the worst. Wilhelm Müller oversaw the systematic theft of artwork, jewelry, and cultural artifacts from thousands of Jewish families. He was killed in 1945 when Allied forces captured the transport he was commanding. She looked up at the locomotive. This transport, engine 447. Emma climbed down from the cab, her face pale but determined. "So Heinrich Müller is trying to recover items his Nazi grandfather stole from Holocaust victims." "That's exactly what he's trying to do. And he's been doing it for 20 years, using legal intimidation and fraud to claim ownership of recovered Holocaust assets." Dr. Chase stood up, brushing dust from her clothes. "Which means that what we're protecting here isn't just valuable, it's evidence of war crimes that some people will do anything to keep hidden." The coded railway schedule that Dr. Chase discovered, tucked inside Wilhelm Müller's personal effects, proved to be the key that unlocked the entire scope of the Nazi looting operation. Written in a mixture of German military code and railroad terminology, it detailed a network of transport routes that had moved stolen assets across occupied Europe and into Germany throughout the war years. Working late into the night in Pete Morrison's garage, Dr. Chase used specialized software on her laptop to decode the schedule, while Emma cross-referenced locations with modern maps and Eli examined the physical evidence they'd collected from the locomotive. The picture that emerged was both more systematic and more personal than any of them had expected. "This isn't just a list of train routes," Dr. Chase explained, pointing to columns of alphanumeric sequences that had initially looked like random letters and numbers. "It's a complete inventory system. Each code represents a specific family's possessions, with detailed information about where the items were taken from and where they were sent for storage or distribution." Emma had spread railroad maps across Pete's workbench, marking locations mentioned in the schedule with colored pins. "Look at this pattern. The trains started in major cities, Paris, Amsterdam, Prague, and then moved through smaller collection points before heading to central storage facilities in Germany." "Collection points," Eli repeated, studying the map. "You mean places where they gathered stolen items before shipping them?" "More than that. These were processing centers where SS officers sorted through family possessions and decided what was valuable enough to send back to Germany." Dr. Chase's voice was heavy with the weight of what she was describing. Wedding rings were melted down for gold. Artwork was evaluated and catalogued. Family photographs and documents were destroyed because they had no monetary value. The systematic nature of the operation was staggering. Each entry in the schedule included not just transportation details, but also information about the families whose possessions had been stolen. Names, addresses, estimated values, and in some cases, notes about whether the families had been relocated, a euphemism that everyone understood meant sent to concentration camps. But it was Pete who made the connection that transformed their understanding of what Thomas Mercer and his network had accomplished. "Look at these dates," he said, pointing to a series of entries from late 1944 and early 1945. These trains were captured by Allied forces before they reached their destinations. The stolen items were recovered while they were still in transit, which means the American military inherited not just the stolen goods, but also the complete documentation of where everything had come from. Dr. Chase added, "Your father's network had access to the original Nazi records. They knew exactly which families each item belonged to." Emma looked up from the laptop where she'd been researching some of the family names mentioned in the schedule. "I found the Rosenberg family, the ones who owned that silver menorah. 3 survivors immigrated to New York after the war. The family still exists, and they've been registered with Holocaust asset recovery organizations for 60 years. The revelation that specific families could still be located and contacted made the abstract concept of returning stolen items suddenly concrete and urgent. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were family treasures that real people had been searching for their entire lives. "How many of the families listed in this schedule are still traceable?" Eli asked. Dr. Chase pulled out a thick folder of reference materials. "Based on my experience with similar cases, probably 30 to 40%. Some family lines were completely destroyed during the Holocaust. Others scattered across the world and lost touch with their heritage. But for the families we can locate, this documentation represents the most complete provenance records I've ever seen." The scope of the recovery operation was becoming clear, but so were the challenges they faced. The schedule referenced storage locations across 3 states, most of them on private property that had changed hands multiple times since the 1940s. Some items had been moved multiple times over the decades as Thomas Mercer's network adapted to changing circumstances and security concerns. "We're going to need help," Dr. Chase said. "This is too big for us to handle alone, and we're going to need legal support if Heinrich Müller and his associates try to interfere with the returns." Emma had been unusually quiet for the past hour, studying the schedule and cross-referencing information on her laptop. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made everyone stop what they were doing. "There's something else. I've been looking at the family names in the Nazi records and comparing them to Holocaust databases." She turned her laptop around so they could see the screen. Some of these families weren't just robbed, they were specifically targeted because of what they owned. The screen showed a database entry for the Goldstein family of Prague, whose portrait painting had been listed in Thomas Mercer's manifest. According to the Holocaust records, Isaac Goldstein had been a prominent art dealer before the war, with a collection that included works by several important European artists. The family had been among the first arrested when German forces occupied Prague, and their entire collection had been confiscated within days of their deportation. They weren't random victims, Emma continued. The Nazis had lists of Jewish families who owned valuable artwork or cultural artifacts. They targeted these families specifically for what they could steal from them. The personal nature of the targeting made the crimes feel even more immediate and brutal. These families had been murdered not just for who they were, but for what they possessed. The artwork and jewelry that Thomas Mercer had spent decades protecting represented not just material wealth, but the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage and family identity, which makes returning these items even more important, Dr. Chase said. For the surviving family members, recovering their heritage is about more than money. It's about reclaiming their identity and honoring the memory of relatives who died protecting these treasures. Pete had been examining the physical locomotive while they worked on the documentation, and his mechanical expertise was revealing additional secrets about Engine 447's wartime modifications. "This engine was built for more than just transportation," he announced. "Look at these modifications to the suspension system and the reinforced flooring in the freight cars. This locomotive was specifically designed to carry extremely heavy loads without damaging delicate cargo. Heavy loads like artwork and sculptures." "Exactly. And look at this." Pete showed them a section of the locomotive's interior that had been fitted with specialized clamps and padding systems. These modifications would have protected paintings and fragile artifacts during transport. Whoever designed this understood that they were carrying irreplaceable cultural treasures. The evidence suggested that Engine 447 had been one of the Nazis' premier art transport vehicles, used specifically for moving the most valuable stolen items. When Allied forces captured the locomotive, they had not just recovered random loot, but had intercepted one of the primary vehicles used in the systematic destruction of Jewish cultural heritage. "No wonder Heinrich Müller is so interested in this locomotive," Eli said. "If his grandfather was commanding this transport when it was captured, then Engine 447 probably contains evidence of his specific war crimes." Dr. Chase nodded grimly. "Which means Müller isn't just trying to recover family property, he's trying to prevent evidence of his grandfather's crimes from becoming public." Emma looked up from her research with an expression that mixed excitement with apprehension. "I think I know why they're so desperate to stop us. I found a reference to SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Müller in a war crimes database. He was being investigated by Allied authorities for art theft and murder when he was killed in 1945. The investigation was never completed because the evidence was lost when his transport was captured. Lost, or hidden by people who wanted to protect it until the right time." "Hidden, Doctor," Chase said with certainty. "Your father and his network weren't just returning stolen property, they were preserving evidence of war crimes and waiting for someone who could use it properly. The weight of responsibility was becoming overwhelming. They weren't just dealing with valuable artifacts or family heirlooms, they were protecting evidence that could provide closure for families who had been waiting 70 years for justice. At the same time, they were confronting people who had spent decades trying to bury that same evidence." "What happens next?" Eli asked. "Next, we start contacting families," Dr. Chase said. "We begin the process of authentication and documentation. and we prepare for Heinrich Müller and his associates to escalate their efforts to stop us. How do we prepare for that? Pete smiled grimly. The same way your father did. We work fast, we work carefully, and we make sure the truth gets documented before anyone can destroy it. Emma closed her laptop and looked around at the three adults who had become her partners in this unexpected mission. One more thing. I've been thinking about what Heinrich Müller said about our financial problems and my college fund. Emma. No, Dad, listen. He was right that we need money, but he was wrong about why that matters. She gestured toward the locomotive and the documents they'd discovered. Grandpa spent 30 years protecting these families' heritage because he believed it was the right thing to do, even though it probably cost him money and definitely put him at risk. If we give up now because we're worried about our own problems, then everything he worked for was meaningless. What are you saying? I'm saying that some things are more important than money. And I'm saying that I'd rather graduate from community college, knowing we did the right thing, than go to Harvard, knowing we sold out Holocaust survivors for our own benefit. The resolution in her voice reminded Eli so strongly of Sarah that for a moment he couldn't speak. His daughter had inherited more than her mother's appearance. She had inherited her moral compass and her ability to see clearly through complex ethical situations. Then we finish what your grandfather started, he said finally. All of it. The discovery of Thomas Mercer's secret journal changed everything they thought they knew about Engine 447 and the mission they had inherited. Hidden inside the locomotive's firebox, protected by a false back wall that had been expertly disguised to look like part of the original construction, the leather-bound journal contained 30 years of carefully documented entries that revealed the true scope of what Thomas and his network had accomplished. Emma found it on a cold morning when she was helping Eli clean out debris from the firebox in preparation for a more thorough restoration. Her hand touched something that felt different from the expected metal and ash, something that gave slightly under pressure. Working carefully with a small crowbar, they pried away what appeared to be a solid back wall to reveal a waterproof container that had been sealed since the late 1970s. The journal was thick, bound in brown leather that had aged to a deep patina. Thomas Mercer's name was embossed on the cover in gold letters that had faded but remained legible. Inside, written in the same careful handwriting they had seen on other documents, was a record that spanned from 1945 to 1978 and told a story of moral complexity that none of them had anticipated. "My God," Dr. Chase whispered as she read the first few entries. "Eli, your father wasn't just returning stolen items to families. He was actively redistributing Nazi wealth to Holocaust survivors who needed immediate assistance." The early entries described the chaos that followed the capture of Engine 447 and its cargo. Allied authorities had been overwhelmed by the volume of stolen items they recovered, and the process of identifying ownership and locating survivors was proceeding slowly, while families faced immediate needs for food, shelter, and medical care. May 15, 1945, received word that the Rosenberg family survivors are in a displaced persons camp near Munich. They have no money, no possessions, nothing but the clothes they were wearing when they were liberated. Meanwhile, their family silver sits in a warehouse in Baltimore, while bureaucrats debate proper procedures for authentication and return. This is wrong. June 3, 1945, made contact with Meyer Goldstein in New York. He is Isaac Goldstein's cousin, survived by hiding in the sewers of Prague for 8 months. He needs money for medical treatment, but the Goldstein family artwork cannot be returned until ownership is properly established. How many more people will die while we follow procedures? August 12, 1945. First redistribution completed. Use network contacts to liquidate some items whose ownership cannot be established and transferred funds to 3 families in immediate need. This goes against official policy, but official policy is letting people starve while their own property sits in storage. The journal documented a secret operation that had continued for decades, with Thomas Mercer and his network using their access to recovered Nazi assets to provide immediate assistance to Holocaust survivors while working to return identifiable items to their rightful owners. They had essentially become an unofficial welfare system for people whose own governments were too slow or too bureaucratic to help. "This is incredible," Emma said, reading over Dr. Chase's shoulder. Grandpa was running his own refugee assistance program. But the journal also revealed the personal cost of this decision. Entry after entry described the moral weight Thomas carried, knowing that he was technically stealing, even if he was stealing from thieves to help victims. He documented every transaction meticulously, keeping records of which items were sold, how much money was raised, and which families received assistance. December 24, 1947. Sarah knows something is wrong, but she doesn't ask questions. She sees me working late into the night, making trips to Chicago and Detroit that I can't explain. She deserves better than a husband who keeps secrets, but some secrets protect people who have already suffered too much. March 10, 1952. Eli asked me today why I keep railroad maps in my study. He's 7 years old and notices everything. How do I explain that those maps show the locations of hidden caches that could help families rebuild their lives? How do I tell him that his father is living a double life? November 18, 1965. INT network is dissolving. Pete Morrison Sr. died last month, taking his segment of the operation with him. Harold Brennan in Chicago wants to retire and turn his records over to the government. We're getting old, and the families we've been helping have either been assisted or are beyond help. Time to decide what to do with what remains. The later entries revealed that by the 1960s, the network had successfully returned hundreds of items to their rightful owners and provided financial assistance to nearly 1,000 Holocaust survivors and their families. But significant assets remained hidden, either because the original owners could not be located or because the items were too dangerous to move without proper legal protection. April 7, 1970, 1909. Decided to preserve what remains rather than risk exposure. Too many people have been protected by our secrecy to jeopardize the operation now. If Eli ever finds this journal, perhaps he will understand that some responsibilities pass from father to son, not as burdens, but as opportunities to complete important work. September 3, 1978. Final entry. All remaining locations secured, all documentation preserved. If something happens to me, the maps and records will guide whoever continues this mission. The items hidden in these locations represent more than money. They represent the hope that someday justice will matter more than procedure. Dr. Chase closed the journal carefully, her hands shaking slightly with the weight of what she had read. Eli, your father and his network returned an estimated $50 million worth of stolen assets to Holocaust survivors over 30 years. They did it without government support, without legal authority, and without recognition. How much is still hidden? Based on these records, approximately $137 million worth of items remain in secured locations. Items that are documented, researched, and ready for return to families who can prove ownership. Emma had been unusually quiet while they read the journal, but now she looked up with an expression that mixed awe with determination. The $187 million. It's not just what's hidden, it's the total value of everything. Grandpa's network protected, 50 million returned plus 137 million still waiting. The scope of Thomas Mercer's accomplishment was staggering, but so was the responsibility they had inherited. They weren't just dealing with a treasure hunt or even a historical recovery project. They were being asked to complete a mission of justice that had shaped their grandfather's entire adult life. "There's something else," Dr. Chase said, pointing to a passage near the end of the journal. "Your father knew that Heinrich Müller's family was looking for these items. He documented several attempts by Nazi descendants to locate and claim recovered assets." January 12, 1976, Ibo Grand. Heinrich Müller, grandson of Wilhelm, made contact through intermediary. Claims family ownership of items transported on engine 447. Provided forged documentation purporting to show legitimate purchase of artwork from Jewish families. Investigation confirms documents are fraudulent, but Müller's persistence suggests he knows more about our operation than we would prefer. May 8, 1977, Müller escalating pressure, now threatening legal action against railroad personnel who unlawfully retained family property. Counter-investigation reveals Müller has been monitoring several network members for years. We may need to accelerate timeline for securing remaining assets. "Your father knew they were coming," Dr. Chase said. "He spent his final years preparing for exactly the situation we're facing now." Pete had been examining the locomotive while they read the journal, and his discovery added another layer to the already complex situation. "There's more than just documentation hidden in this engine," he announced. "I found another sealed compartment, and this one contains actual items, not just papers." The compartment was located beneath the locomotive's coal tender, accessible only by removing several sections of flooring and working in the cramped space beneath the engine. Inside, carefully wrapped and protected from moisture, were dozens of items that matched descriptions from Thomas Mercer's manifest. Jewelry boxes containing rings, necklaces, and bracelets that bore the patina of age and careful preservation. Small paintings in protective tubes, rolled carefully to prevent damage. Religious artifacts including silver menorahs, Torah pointers, and ceremonial cups. Each item was tagged with a number that corresponded to entries in the journal, complete with family names and histories. "This is just a sample," Dr. Chase said, examining the tags. "Your father kept representative items here, probably to use for authentication and research purposes. The bulk of the collection is still hidden in the locations marked on his maps." Emma picked up a small silver locket and opened it to reveal photographs of a young couple in 1930s clothing. The woman wore a dress with elaborate embroidery, and the man had the kind of serious expression common in formal photographs of the era. On the back of the locket, an inscription in Hebrew characters had been carefully engraved. "Look at this," she said, showing them the photographs. "These aren't just artifacts. They're pieces of people's lives, family memories that survived the Holocaust because someone cared enough to protect them." The personal nature of the items made the abstract concept of returning stolen property suddenly immediate and emotional. These objects had been held by people who were murdered for who they were and what they represented. Protecting them wasn't just about historical justice, it was about preserving the memory of individual human lives. "Emma's right," Eli said. "This isn't about money, and it's not about historical significance. It's about giving families back the pieces of their relatives' lives that survived when everything else was destroyed." Dr. Chase nodded, carefully placing the locket back in its protective wrapping. "Which means we need to move quickly. Now that we know the full scope of what your father protected, we can begin the process of contacting families and arranging returns. But we also need to be prepared for Heinrich Müller to escalate his efforts to stop us. What can he do? The law is on our side." "The law is on our side, but Müller has resources and connections that we don't. He's been trying to recover these items for 40 years, and he's not going to give up easily." Dr. Chase paused, looking around at the locomotive and the evidence of Thomas Mercer's life work. "He's also not going to risk this documentation becoming public." If these records are released, they'll provide evidence of war crimes that could trigger new investigations into his grandfather's activities. Then what do? We do what your father did. We work fast, we work carefully, and we make sure the families get their heritage back before anyone can stop us. Emma stood up, brushing dust from her clothes and looking around at the locomotive that had become the center of their lives. When do we start? We start tomorrow, Dr. Go, Chase said, because tonight I'm going to make some phone calls to families who have been waiting 70 years to learn that their family treasures survived the Holocaust. The hand-drawn map that Dr. Chase found, folded inside the back cover of Thomas Mercer's journal, was both more detailed and more ambitious than anything they had expected. Drawn with the precision of a trained railroad engineer, it showed locations across Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, where assets remained hidden, each site marked with symbols that corresponded to detailed inventory lists and GPS coordinates that had been added in pencil during the 1990s. Your father updated this map for decades, Doctor, Chase observed, studying the careful notations and coordinate systems. He used modern technology to preserve exact locations, even as landmarks changed and property ownership shifted. Emma had spent the morning cross-referencing the map coordinates with satellite imagery on her laptop, and what she discovered was both encouraging and concerning. Most of these locations are still accessible, but 3 of them are now in developed areas. One is underneath a shopping mall parking lot, and another is on property that's been turned into a subdivision, which means we need to prioritize the locations we can still reach, Eli said. How many sites are we talking about? 17 primary locations, plus 6 backup sites that were established in case the primary caches were compromised. Doctor, Chase spread the map across Pete's workbench, weighting the corners with tools to keep it flat. Based on the inventory lists, we're looking at items that could fill a small museum. The scope of the recovery operation was staggering, but so was the time pressure they faced. Heinrich Müller's increasingly aggressive surveillance suggested that their window for completing the mission was closing rapidly. Twice in the past week, Emma had spotted unfamiliar cars parked near their house, and Pete had discovered evidence that someone had attempted to break into his garage during the night. They're escalating, Dr. Chase warned. Müller knows we're close to something significant, and he's running out of time to stop us through legal intimidation. Pete had been studying the map with the eye of someone who understood both geography and logistics. If we're going to do this, we need a plan that gets us to multiple sites quickly and safely. Some of these locations are in remote areas where we'd be vulnerable to interference. What kind of plan? The kind your father would have used. We work at night, we work in teams, and we document everything before we move anything. Pete pointed to the 3 closest locations, all within 50 miles of Millbrook. We start with these sites, verify that the items are still there, and establish a secure process for authentication and cataloging. Emma had been researching the families whose items were hidden at the mapped locations, and her discoveries were providing both motivation and urgency for their mission. I found the Rosenberg family descendants in New York. The grandmother, Rachel Rosenberg, is 91 years old and has been registered with Holocaust recovery organizations since 1948. She's been looking for her family's silver menorah for 75 years. What about the other families? The Goldsteins have relatives in Israel and Canada. The Weiss family survivors are in Los Angeles. Most of these families have been searching for their missing items for decades. Emma's voice carried the weight of stories she'd been reading online. Some of them have children and grandchildren who have never seen their family's heritage because it was stolen before they were born. The personal stories made the abstract mission suddenly immediate and urgent. They weren't just dealing with historical artifacts, they were dealing with family memories and cultural identity that had been preserved through the darkest period of human history. Dr. Chase had been making phone calls to colleagues and organizations around the world, and the response had been overwhelming. I've contacted 8 different Holocaust recovery organizations, and every one of them has families looking for items that match what's on your father's list. This could be the largest single recovery of missing Holocaust assets in 30 years. But the excitement was tempered by growing concerns about Mueller's activities. Pete's contacts in the railroad community had reported unusual inquiries about Engine 447's history and current location. Legal firms in Chicago and Milwaukee had been asking questions about property rights and asset recovery laws. Most troubling, Emma had discovered social media posts suggesting that collectors and treasure hunters were being recruited for what was described as a historical recovery operation in the Midwest. "Mueller's building a team," Dr. Chase said after reviewing the information Emma had gathered. "He's not just planning to file legal challenges, he's planning to physically prevent us from completing the returns. What can we do about it? We stay ahead of him. We secure the items before he can interfere, and we make sure the documentation is in the hands of proper authorities before he can challenge our activities." The plan they developed was ambitious and risky. Working in 3 teams, they would visit the nearest cache locations over a period of 4 nights, document and photograph everything they found, and secure the most important items for immediate authentication and return. Dr. Chase would coordinate with international recovery organizations to expedite the process of contacting families and arranging transfers. Emma had volunteered to handle the technical aspects of documentation, using her laptop and digital cameras to create detailed records that could be shared with researchers around the world. If we photograph everything and upload it to secure servers, then even if something happens to the physical items, the documentation will survive. Pete had enlisted the help of his son Mark, a mechanic who had inherited both his father's technical skills and his understanding of the community's hidden history. "Mark knows the back roads and abandoned properties better than anyone. If we need to move quickly or avoid main highways, he can get us where we need to go." The first location they planned to visit was an abandoned farmhouse. The abandoned mine shaft outside Millbrook had been sealed with concrete and warning signs for 30 years. But Thomas Mercer's map indicated that the main cache was hidden in a section that remained accessible through a maintenance tunnel. At dawn, on their 4th day of recovery operations, Eli found himself standing at the entrance to what his father had described as the primary repository, the location where the most valuable and historically significant items had been preserved. Dr. Chase examined the entrance with the careful attention of someone who had explored similar sites around the world. "Your father chose well. Mine shafts provide natural protection from temperature fluctuations and humidity, and the remote location makes discovery unlikely." Emma had spent the early morning hours researching the mine's history, discovering that it had been a limestone quarry during the 1920s before being abandoned when more profitable sites opened further south. The tunnel system extended nearly a quarter-mile underground, with multiple chambers that had been used for equipment storage during the mining operation. According to the mine company records, this section was never officially sealed, she reported. "The concrete barriers were installed to prevent accidents, but the tunnel system beyond them is intact." Pete and Mark Morrison had brought specialized equipment for safely accessing the underground chambers, battery-powered lights, air quality monitors, and rope systems for navigating the uneven terrain. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on joining the expedition despite her age, carrying a leather satchel containing authentication tools and reference materials she had preserved from her late husband's railroad days. "The items in this location are the most important," she explained, as they prepared to enter the tunnel. "Your father moved them here in 1971, when he realized that the other sites might eventually be compromised. These are the pieces that represent entire family collections, irreplaceable cultural artifacts that survived the Holocaust only because someone cared enough to preserve them." The entrance to the accessible tunnel was hidden behind a section of deteriorated fencing that looked like casual vandalism, but had actually been carefully arranged to provide concealed access. Working in pairs for safety, they made their way through the narrow passage that led to the main underground chamber. What they found exceeded even their highest expectations. The chamber had been converted into a professional storage facility, with climate control systems powered by a generator that Thomas Mercer had somehow managed to keep operational for decades. Wooden crates lined the walls, each one labeled with coded numbers that corresponded to detailed inventory lists in his journal. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chase whispered, playing her flashlight across rows of carefully preserved containers. "Your father created a private museum underground. These storage conditions are better than what you'd find in most official facilities." Emma began photographing the chamber systematically, documenting the scope and organization of the storage system. Each crate was marked not only with inventory codes, but also with family names and country of origin, creating a visual map of the cultural destruction that had occurred across Nazi-occupied Europe. Rosenberg, Vienna, Goldstein, Prague, Weiss, Berlin. She read from the labels. "Dad, there are families from every country the Nazis invaded. Grandpa preserved heritage from across the entire continent." Opening the first crate revealed treasures that made everyone fall silent with awe. The Nazi gold coins that validated everything Thomas Mercer had risked his life to protect were just the beginning. Beneath them lay items of immeasurable personal and cultural significance, hand-illuminated religious texts, family photographs in silver frames, jewelry that bore the craftsmanship of generations of European artisans. Eli lifted a small wooden box and opened it to reveal a collection of gold coins bearing the marks of different European mints. But it was the note tucked beneath the coins that brought tears to his eyes. "Wedding gift from my grandmother, carried by the Levy family from Poland to Paris to New York. May these coins provide hope to those who have lost everything else." Thomas Mercer, 1952. "He wasn't just preserving artifacts," Eli said, showing the note to the others. "He was preserving stories. Each of these items has a family history attached to it." Dr. Chase opened another crate and found herself looking at artwork that made her gasp with recognition. This is a painting by Isaac Goldstein himself, not part of his collection, but his own work. The Nazis didn't just steal his family's possessions, they stole his artistic legacy. The painting depicted a Prague street scene from before the war, showing Jewish families in traditional dress walking through a neighborhood that had been destroyed during the Nazi occupation. The brushwork was skilled and emotional, capturing both the beauty of pre-war Jewish life and the tragedy of its destruction. Emma found the documentation that explained the painting's significance. Isaac Goldstein painted this in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. He gave it to another prisoner who survived and eventually made it to America. That survivor donated it to the recovery network because he believed it should be returned to the Goldstein family, along with their other possessions. The personal stories behind each item made the abstract concept of Holocaust asset recovery suddenly immediate and urgent. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were pieces of individual human lives that had survived one of history's darkest chapters. But their archaeological work was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the mine entrance. Mark Morrison, who had remained outside as a lookout, appeared at the tunnel entrance with an expression of controlled alarm. "We have company," he announced. 3 SUVs with Illinois plates, and they're not here for sightseeing." Through the tunnel entrance, they could see Heinrich Müller and at least 6 associates organizing what appeared to be a professional recovery operation. They had brought metal detectors, excavation equipment, and armed security personnel who were positioning themselves around the mine entrance. "They found us," Dr. Chase said grimly, "and they're planning to take everything." Emma continued photographing the items they had discovered, working with desperate efficiency to document as much as possible before Müller's team reached the underground chamber. If we can't protect the physical items, at least we can preserve the evidence. Pete examined the tunnel system and identified a secondary exit that led to an abandoned access road on the far side of the mine property. We can get out through the maintenance tunnel, but we'll have to leave most of the items behind. No, Eli said firmly. My father spent 30 years protecting these families' heritage. We're not abandoning it now. Mrs. Patterson opened her leather satchel and revealed that she had been carrying more than authentication tools. Your father left instructions for exactly this situation, she said, producing a thick folder of legal documents. These are transfer orders, signed by federal authorities and witnessed by federal judges. They give us legal custody of recovered Holocaust assets, pending authentication and return to rightful owners. Are they legitimate? They're legitimate, and they predate any claims that Mueller might make by 30 years. She smiled with satisfaction. Your father was a railroad man, but he understood the importance of proper paperwork. The sound of metal detectors and excavation equipment was getting closer, but the legal documents gave them options they hadn't realized they possessed. Dr. Chase contacted federal authorities using a satellite phone, reporting the discovery of a major Holocaust asset cache and requesting immediate assistance to prevent the items from being stolen by people with fraudulent ownership claims. Help is coming, she announced, after a tense conversation with FBI agents in Chicago. But it's going to take at least 2 hours for them to get here. Then we hold them off for 2 hours, Eli decided, whatever it takes. The confrontation at the mine entrance was unlike anything Eli had imagined when he first bought Engine 447 6 weeks earlier. Heinrich Müller stood at the head of a group that included armed security personnel, legal representatives, and what appeared to be professional treasure recovery specialists. They had positioned themselves to control access to the mine shaft while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate archaeological operation. Mr. Mercer, Müller called out as Eli emerged from the tunnel, I believe you have something that belongs to my family. The list of rightful heirs that Emma had discovered in the underground chamber was still in her hands, dozens of names and addresses of Holocaust survivor families who had been searching for their heritage for 70 years. She held it up so Müller could see it clearly. Actually, we have something that belongs to these families, she replied. Families whose possessions were stolen by your grandfather and his SS unit during the war. Müller's composed demeanor slipped for the first time since they had met him. Those families are dead. Their claims died with them. No, they're not. Emma had been making phone calls throughout their recovery operation, and her research had connected them directly with survivors and their descendants. Rachel Rosenberg is 91 years old and lives in Brooklyn. She's been looking for her family's menorah since 1948. The Goldstein family has relatives in 3 countries who have been searching for their father's artwork. These families are very much alive, and they have legal rights to their heritage. Dr. Chase emerged from the tunnel, carrying the authentication equipment and legal documents that Mrs. Patterson had provided. Mr. Mueller, you should know that we've already contacted federal authorities about this discovery. FBI agents are en route to secure the site and protect these materials until proper authentication and return procedures can be completed. Dr. Chase, always the idealist, Mueller replied. But I'm afraid your federal authorities have no jurisdiction here. We have obtained local search and recovery permits, and we have legal documentation proving our family's ownership of items transported on Engine 447. Brennan stepped forward with a briefcase full of papers that looked impressive, but which Dr. Chase examined with obvious skepticism. These documents purport to show that your grandfather purchased artwork from Jewish families in occupied territories, she said after a quick review. But they're dated after the families were deported to concentration camps. You're claiming ownership based on transactions with people who were already dead. The dates on those documents have been verified by expert authenticators. Expert authenticators who work for auction houses that specialize in selling questionable Nazi-era acquisitions. Dr. Chase shot back. I know your operation, Mueller. You've been using forged documentation to claim ownership of Holocaust assets for 20 years. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of law enforcement, not the federal agents they had called, but sheriff's deputies who appeared to be working with Mueller's team. The deputies positioned themselves to support Mueller's claim that he had legitimate authority to conduct the recovery operation. This is a lawful archaeological investigation, one of the deputies announced. These people are interfering with a permitted operation. Pete Morrison stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had lived in the community for 60 years and understood exactly how local politics worked. Deputy Williams, does your permitted operation include armed security personnel threatening local residents? Because I've got the county commissioner on speed dial, and I don't think he's going to appreciate finding out that his sheriff's department is helping outsiders intimidate Millbrook families. The threat of local political complications gave Mueller pause, but it also escalated the tension in a way that made everyone nervous. His security personnel were clearly prepared for physical confrontation, and the isolated location of the mine shaft meant that any violence would go unobserved by potential witnesses. Emma had been documenting the entire confrontation with her camera, and her next action surprised everyone involved. She began live streaming the standoff directly to social media platforms, narrating the situation for an audience that was growing by the minute. This is Emma Mercer reporting from outside Millbrook, Indiana, where my family has discovered a cache of Holocaust assets that my grandfather preserved for 70 years, she announced to her phone's camera. We're trying to return these items to the families they were stolen from, but we're being confronted by people who claim their Nazi relatives owned them legitimately. The live stream was immediately picked up and shared by Holocaust education organizations, Jewish community groups, and historical preservation societies. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching the confrontation and sharing the story across multiple platforms. "Young lady," Mueller said with barely controlled anger, "you're interfering with a legitimate legal process." "I'm documenting an attempt to steal Holocaust survivors' heritage," Emma replied, keeping the camera focused on Mueller and his team. "And now, thousands of people are watching you do it." The social media attention was having exactly the effect Emma had hoped for. Phone calls began arriving from news organizations, federal agencies, and advocacy groups who had been alerted to the situation by the viral video. Dr. Chase's contacts at the Holocaust Memorial Museum were mobilizing legal support, and Holocaust survivor organizations were demanding that law enforcement protect the recovered assets. But Mueller was also receiving phone calls, and his conversations suggested that he had backup plans that none of them had anticipated. Armed security personnel began positioning themselves more aggressively, and additional vehicles were arriving to reinforce his team. "Mr. Mercer," Mueller said, ending his phone conversation with an expression of cold determination, "you have 10 minutes to turn over any items you've removed from this site. After that, my associates will retrieve them by whatever means necessary." The threat was clear, but so was the response from the community that had rallied around Eli and Emma's mission. Cars began arriving from Millbrook, not just Pete Morrison's friends from the railroad community, but dozens of residents who had been following the story and understood its significance for their town's history. Mrs. Patterson emerged from one of the arriving cars carrying a thermos of coffee and a folder full of additional documentation. "I called everyone," she announced. "The whole town knows what's happening here, and they're not going to let outsiders steal our history." The sight of an elderly librarian confronting armed security personnel became the defining image of the standoff. Mrs. Patterson walked directly up to Mueller with the fearless confidence of someone who had lived through enough history to understand what really mattered. "Heinrich Mueller," she said, "I knew your grandfather. He came through Millbrook in 1945 as a prisoner of war, and I saw what he had stolen from families he helped murder. Your grandfather was a thief and a killer, and you're not going to profit from his crimes in my town. The personal confrontation broke the stalemate that had developed around legal technicalities and jurisdictional disputes. This was no longer about paperwork or permits. It was about moral responsibility and community values that ran deeper than any legal authority. Sheriff's deputies found themselves caught between their orders to support Mueller's operation and their responsibility to protect local residents who were clearly in the right. The live stream had attracted enough attention that any violence would be witnessed by thousands of people and would trigger federal intervention. Emma continued broadcasting as FBI agents finally arrived to take control of the situation. The federal authorities had jurisdiction over Holocaust asset recovery, and they immediately secured the mine site while beginning the process of authenticating the items and verifying the legal claims. "This is Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI's art crime team," the lead agent announced. "This site is now under federal protection, pending completion of our investigation into recovered Holocaust assets. Anyone interfering with this investigation will be arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law." Mueller and his team were forced to withdraw, but not before making it clear that the legal battle was far from over. "This isn't finished, Mercer," he warned. "These items belong to my family, and I will recover them through proper legal channels." But as the FBI agents began cataloging the items in the underground chamber, the scope of Thomas Mercer's achievement became clear to everyone involved. They had preserved not just valuable artifacts, but an entire cross-section of European Jewish culture that had been targeted for destruction during the Holocaust. "Mr. Mercer," Agent Martinez said after examining the storage facility, "your father created one of the most significant private preservation efforts in Holocaust recovery history. The items in this chamber represent dozens of families whose heritage survived only because someone cared enough to protect it." Emma looked around at the community members who had rallied to support their mission, the federal agents who were ensuring the items would be properly returned, and the live stream audience that had grown to tens of thousands of viewers around the world. "Grandpa would be proud," she said, finally turning off the camera that had documented their victory. 6 months after the confrontation at the mine shaft, Eli stood beside engine 447 as the restored locomotive bell rang out across Millbrook for the first time in decades. The sound was clear and strong, carrying across the town like a celebration of both remembrance and renewal. Emma stood beside him, no longer the angry teenager who had been embarrassed by her father's seemingly foolish purchase, but a young woman who understood that some decisions that look crazy to the world turn out to be exactly what history demands. The locomotive had been completely restored, using funds provided by the grateful families whose heritage had been returned to them. Engine 447 now served as the centerpiece of the Thomas Mercer Memorial Holocaust Education Center, a museum and research facility that had been established in the building that once housed Henderson's scrapyard. The irony that a place where discarded items went to be forgotten had become a place where rescued treasures were remembered was not lost on anyone who knew the story. Dr. Margaret Chase had accepted the position of director for the Education Center, bringing her expertise and international connections to Millbrook in a move that had transformed the small Indiana town into an unexpected center for Holocaust recovery research. "Your father's documentation and preservation methods have become a model for recovery operations around the world," she told Eli, as they watched busloads of students arriving for educational programs. "Universities and museums are studying his techniques and applying them to other preservation projects." The financial rewards of their mission had exceeded even Dr. Chase's most optimistic projections. The families whose items had been returned had voluntarily contributed more than enough money to secure Emma's college education, pay off the family's mortgage, and establish a substantial endowment for ongoing recovery work. More importantly, the finder's fees and authentication rewards provided by various organizations had given Eli the financial security to pursue work that had meaning rather than just paying bills. I never imagined that doing the right thing could be so rewarding in practical terms. Eli had told Emma as they reviewed the college acceptance letters and scholarship offers that had arrived throughout the spring. Emma had been accepted to Georgetown University with a full scholarship to study international relations and Holocaust studies, a path that would allow her to continue the work her grandfather had begun. The letters from grateful families had been the most meaningful reward of all. Rachel Rosenberg, now 92, had traveled from Brooklyn to Millbrook for the memorial dedication, bringing with her 3 generations of family members who had never seen their great-grandmother's menorah. When she held the silver artifact for the first time in 75 years, her tears had reminded everyone present why their work mattered more than money or recognition. "My mother carried this menorah when we fled Vienna," Rachel had said, her voice strong despite her age. "She held it when the Nazis separated our family at the train station. I thought it was lost forever, but Thomas Mercer kept it safe until someone could bring it home. How do you thank a man for giving you back your mother's blessing?" Similar stories had arrived from around the world, as families learned that their heritage had survived the Holocaust and been preserved by people who understood its significance. The Goldstein family had recovered not only their father's artwork, but also his personal paintings that documented Jewish life in Prague before the war. The Weiss family had been reunited with religious texts that had been in their family for generations, books that had survived when the people who read them had not. Pete Morrison had been recognized by the Indiana Historical Society for his role in preserving the state's hidden Holocaust recovery history. At 74, he had become an unexpected celebrity, traveling to conferences and educational events to share the story of the railroad network that had operated in secret for 30 years. "The thing people don't understand," he told audiences, "is that Tom Mercer and his friends weren't trying to be heroes. They were just railroad men who believed that finishing the job was more important than following orders." Heinrich Müller's legal challenges had been unsuccessful in every court where they were filed. The forged documentation his team had used to claim ownership of Holocaust assets had triggered a federal investigation that revealed a decades-long pattern of fraud and intimidation. Müller himself was facing criminal charges for attempted theft of federal evidence and conspiracy to defraud Holocaust survivors. His network of fraudulent claimants had been exposed and was being investigated by authorities in multiple countries. "Justice moves slowly sometimes," Dr. Chase had observed, "but it does move. The families who suffered during the Holocaust are finally seeing some of the people who profited from their suffering held accountable for their crimes." The Education Center had become a destination for researchers and families from around the world who were working on their own recovery projects. The archives containing Thomas Mercer's documentation had helped identify items in museums and private collections that had been stolen during the war, leading to additional returns and legal challenges against institutions that had acquired Holocaust assets without proper provenance research. Emma had spent her summer break working as an intern at the center, helping to digitize documents and coordinate with international recovery organizations. Her experience had reinforced her decision to pursue a career in international justice and Holocaust education. "I want to help other families find what Grandpa helped preserve," she had told Eli. "There are still thousands of items out there waiting to be returned to the right people." The restored locomotive bell that now served as the symbol of the Memorial Center had been polished until it gleamed like new metal, but it carried the patina of age and history that reminded visitors of the long journey from theft to recovery to return. The bell rang every day at noon, a sound that had become part of Millbrook's identity and a reminder that some stories take generations to complete. As Eli listened to the bell on that anniversary morning, he reflected on the journey that had brought his family from desperation to purpose in less than a year. The decision to spend his last $3,000 on a rusted locomotive had seemed like madness to everyone who knew him, including himself. But sometimes the choices that seem most foolish turn out to be the ones that reveal who we really are and what we're capable of becoming. Emma stood beside him wearing the Georgetown University t-shirt that represented her future and holding a photograph of Thomas Mercer that represented their family's past. "Dad," she said, "do you think Grandpa knew what would happen when he hid all this documentation?" "I think he hoped," Eli replied. "I think he hoped that someday someone would care enough to finish what he started." The town around them had been transformed by their discovery, but not in ways that anyone could have predicted. Millbrook had gained international recognition not for its manufacturing or its agriculture, but for its role in preserving justice and human dignity during the darkest chapter of the 20th century. Tourism had brought economic benefits, but more importantly, the community had gained a sense of pride and purpose that came from knowing they had contributed to something larger than their own concerns. Mrs. Patterson, now 87 and serving as the volunteer coordinator for the education center, appeared beside them, carrying a fresh thermos of coffee and a folder full of correspondence from families around the world. "More letters today," she announced. "3 families in Canada want to visit the center, and there's a researcher from Germany who thinks we might have information about items stolen from a synagogue in Berlin." The work continued, as Thomas Mercer had known it would. Each returned item led to new discoveries. Each family, reunited with their heritage, provided information that helped locate other missing pieces. The network he had established in the 1940s had become a model for recovery efforts that were still finding and returning Holocaust assets in the 21st century. As the bell finished ringing and its sound faded across the town, Eli put his arm around Emma's shoulders and smiled at the locomotive that had changed their lives. Engine 447 would never run again, but she had completed the most important journey of all, the journey from symbol of destruction to symbol of hope, from evidence of humanity's capacity for evil to proof of its capacity for justice. "You know what I think Grandpa would say if he could see all this?" Emma asked. "What?" "He'd say that sometimes the longest journeys start with the smallest steps, and that the most important destinations are the ones you can't see when you begin." She looked around at the memorial center, the visiting families, and the community that had rallied around their mission. He'd say that buying a rusty old train was the smartest thing you ever did, even if it took 6 months for anyone else to understand why. Eli laughed, remembering the day he had stood in Henderson's scrapyard and tried to explain to himself why he was spending money he couldn't afford on a locomotive that would never run. He had thought he was chasing his father's ghost, but instead he had discovered his father's legacy. The rust had hidden more than just decay. It had hidden the kind of destiny that comes to people who are willing to take risks for reasons they can't fully explain. The bell fell silent, but its message continued to resonate across Millbrook and around the world. Some treasures are worth more than gold, some stories take generations to complete, and sometimes the people who look most foolish turn out to be the ones who understand what really matters. In a small town in Indiana, a man who was mocked for buying a rusted locomotive had helped dozens of families reclaim their heritage and proved that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The locomotive sat silent on its tracks, no longer carrying cargo but still carrying hope. Hope that families scattered by history could be reunited with their past. Hope that truth could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it, and hope that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to honor the responsibilities that history placed in their hands. Thomas Mercer's mission was complete, but his legacy continued in the lives of the families who had recovered their heritage, the community that had learned the power of standing up for justice, and the daughter who would carry his commitment to human dignity into the next generation. The bell would ring again tomorrow, and the day after that, as long as there were stories to remember and families to serve. Some investments paid dividends for generations, and some purchases that seem foolish to the world turn out to be exactly what the future needs. In Millbrook, Indiana, a rusted locomotive had taught an entire community that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Things like justice, memory, and the courage to do what's right even when everyone thinks you're crazy. The town no longer laughed at the man who bought a train that would never run. Instead, they honored him as the man who understood that some journeys are worth taking even when you can't see the destination, and some risks are worth taking even when you can't afford the cost. Eli Mercer had bought more than a locomotive that day. In Henderson's scrapyard, he had bought the chance to complete his father's work and discover who he was meant to become. As the sun set over Millbrook, painting the restored locomotive in shades of gold and amber, the memorial bell caught the last light of day and reflected it back across the town like a promise that some stories, no matter how long they take to unfold, always find their way to the ending they deserve.